And I also want to acknowledge gratefully the funding of the Automotive Research Council, Partnership Research Council in McMaster, and Charlotte in particular, so who's funded the research for this particular project that we have. And first of all, quick apologies. My wife and my son will be evicted from the hotel in about an hour, and so I will not be able to sort of stay for the full session, so just bear that in mind. Okay, so what we're looking at is unions and high-performance work systems in the Southern Ontario automotive assembly sector. So the way we are looking at this is a kind of a point of departure is that there's been a kind of a debate that there's been a commoditization of final assembly operations in the auto industry globally. That is, place-specific differences, labor capital relations in specific places do not mean that much ultimately to how work gets organized. So there's been this kind of convergence in effect across different locations. So this notion of commoditization that Mordew and Sweeney have introduced into the debate. Also, this paper touches on how unions, labor standards, and high-performance work systems interact. So there's a literature, especially in Europe, on this, but elsewhere. And then in particular, some more recent work by Wenton in China and in Mexico on unions and their role as agents in hybridization of high-performance work systems. Okay, so there's been a very long-standing debate in economics and industrial relations about union impacts on innovation and firm performance. A lot of this is very difficult to directly measure. So Gordon Betjeman talks about a more indirect effect of unions, both in the workplace, but also in terms of overall labor standards. And so as Hirsch has pointed out, a lot of this research rests heavily on evidence that is dated and arguably unable to identify truly causal effects. And it's very heavily scale dependent. It's like, do you measure these effects at sectoral scale, at firm scale, and so forth? So basically, from this literature, we conclude that impacts of unions and labor standards are often contingent on broader sets of institutions and even enterprise scale level factors, okay? So that we need to, be aware of these broader sets of factors, but a lot of things are actually happening at the enterprise scale, place-based scales in terms of how these things actually work out in terms of impact. Okay, so just sort of looking at the broad literature, so there's been a lot of interest in the role of so-called strong unions. We can talk about what that really means in terms of actually facilitating high-performance work system adaptation. And then Robson Roca in Denmark has talked about especially shop stewards as leaders of employee-driven innovation in Denmark. Also a lot of work in Scandinavia and Italy about the indirect role of union representation combining with these new direct forms of team-based and individual-based high-performance work systems, that there can be positive synergies between them. So Christensen and Roca also kind of developed this as that unions they see as a potential role of jointly striving for the co-construction of high-performance work systems, because what they're doing is being agents in the actual firm level and indeed enterprise scale level, developing new ways of organizing and benchmarking their activities, further developing formal institutions of collaboration, and then in a sense being kind of part of the experiments of actually adopting these new systems. And so even in nations that have relatively weak labor standards and unions, such as China and such as Mexico, Wenton has found that there is actually influence over shift systems, over the way in which work rates get scheduled and so forth like this. But there's also a couple of risk factors for unions. First is that it's pretty clear that in almost all of the research suggests that high-performance work systems have increased work intensities. That is, the amount of work being produced per worker per hour has been increasing. It's become much more standardized and rigid in certain ways. And also that there are real risks for unions entering into partnerships over high performance work systems, whether these partnerships are formal in the contractual sense or whether they're informal. There's no real guarantee of win-win outcomes. There's a lot of other factors that come into play. So, you know, whether unions go into these is dependent on many kinds of things, but there's no guarantees. There's factors outside of the control of all the different agents that can disrupt these and not deliver the things that unions and their workforce thinks they're going to get. So some things I kind of talked a little bit about yesterday in my presentation is that if we look at the United States and Canada, there's a institutional context of adversarialism. Livingston and Rykoff talk about the influence gap, that is, workers actually don't really use their full training and education in the workplace. Despite all of this stuff about, you know, creative workers and things like this, we actually find that that's the case more than anything else. And basically, at the end of the day, employers are very reluctant to grant employees formal voice in the firm. Now, there has been some changes in the wake of the 2008-09 crisis. Some board representatives from unions, greater kind of collaboration at the level of the workplace. And the problem with these is that they are really very fragile. The voice is not legally mandated. They depend on 3 to 4 year contracts. And really, can employees really trust managers? That's really comes right down to it. Even when managers act in good faith, they don't control all of the possible situations that can occur. Okay, so in Canada, Unifor, formerly known as Canadian Auto Workers, has long been opposed to so-called co-management and lean variants of high-performance work systems. So going back to the 1990s, the Lean Production Conference in Port Elgin, and some of us were there in our younger days, right? They were the only union in North America to have an office dedicated to work organization, so they were really actually very interested in this. But at the plant level, there was always leeway in terms of cooperation. So what they were saying at the national scale and what they were doing at the local didn't always jive together. And since 2000, there's been overall a very much lessened focus by the union on the resistance of this for a number of reasons we'll talk about. But we don't really know, there's not been a lot of research conducted over the last 20 years about what's really going on at the plant scale, okay? So the study that Lorenzo and I are doing has been going to the assembly plants, trying to do as many interviews as we can. So we've gone to 7 out of 9 assembly plants in Southern Ontario, 2 non-union, 5 unionized. We've conducted 7 semi-structured interviews with 20 union and management respondents. And in some cases, we've been able to do matched interviews and so forth like this with managers and unions and so forth, okay? And so that gives you, some of you will be able to guess pretty rapidly which of these plants, you didn't hear them from me, so. Okay, so what we find is that there's been some trends towards commoditization. High-performance work systems have been associated with relatively limited formal skill enlargement and increased work intensity, kinds of things we expected to find, given the literature. However, there's also some significant variation due to model changes, company and plant-specific histories, and also what we're finding is that employees and indeed unions are playing roles in incremental process innovation. Whether there's a formal role for them or not, they're playing this role. So we see some of the quotes from managers, this notion of this very structured environment, but that there's these kinds of ongoing process innovations at the level of the individual plants that often doesn't get recognized in the broader literature. Obviously, these Kaizening processes are taking place within a context of a lot of not what we'll call surveillance, but structures in terms of what their financial returns are. But there is this role, and a lot of plants are actually acting as learning sites for the broader application of these work systems. It's not simply a top-down process, but there's a kind of iterative process going on. So assembly, though, remains very highly intensive, labor intensive, despite, you know, Industry 4.0 and all those kinds of things. There's a, when we talk to the representatives, it's very clear that, there's so much variation, especially in final assembly, that automation has actually been counterproductive in some cases. And so some of the Canadian plants actually have less automation than their US counterparts, but in fact are more productive because they have less downtime, they have more ability to cope with these things because they don't rely on technology as much. So the union, so some of the things we've already talked about, the union resisted lean in the 1990s, but not now. So Dave Robertson, some of you know in here, a very important protagonist against lean production, said, how lean are you going to be in the 90s? Now we have gotten smarter and forced the firm to define what high performance work systems are. So the union has become a lot more open-minded. Broader context of NAFTA and the pressures on the union. However, what we're seeing is that the union is actually playing quite a significant role in process innovation. First of all, via contract negotiations every 3 years, but also they have ergonomics and production standard representatives in the plant that can challenge management about how work gets organized, about the timing of work and so forth. It's not a huge amount of power, but it is some power that they've been able to negotiate at the plant level. So what they're trying to do is use the ergonomic representatives to cut down on repetitive strain injuries, to challenge certain ways in which work is getting done. So you would say they force the firm and managers to find alternative ways to get their jobs done. So the managers talk about this. They acknowledge that there's a dialogue going on. There's a toing and froing. And in some plants, there's actually informal partnerships. In one plant, I requested an interview with the union, and the union invited the management in. And I'd never, in my 30 years of doing interviews, ever had that situation happen where unions invited the management in, and I wanted to do a separate interview, of course. So that told me a lot about what I needed to know about how that plant and the management and the union were presenting themselves as kind of part of this team. In some cases, there's these informal partnerships, including benchmarking with other plants. Some of the locals have, in fact, taken on some supervisory, lower-level supervisory and human resource functions. So this is kind of a blurring almost going on at the shop level. But there's really no formal representation above the shop floor in the sense of how to bring innovation and things together. Okay, thank you. So the union, though, still plays an adversary role, partly because it needs to do so, because they say, you know, the firm left to its own devices will simply cherry pick. They're not being held, we need to hold them accountable to their own processes. If something goes wrong, management says just keep things moving. The priority is really just maximizing production. The employee is supposed to be at the top of this pyramid that they've told us about we need to do, but that's not what's being done. So that now they have the ergonomists and the safety standard people sign things off. It can delay things for a few days. They try to lock the line speed. So apparently in the middle of the night shift, some of the firms would speed up production, and now they have somebody who's always timing this, because they are talking about takt times of 58, 59 seconds for every minute. So everything is full. So the challenge for the workforce in the union is that there's no allowance for buffer now. Only union negotiated breaks. Nothing else is allowed. They have some rotation with the teams. Some people have restrictions because of injuries, because of RSIs, and can only do certain tasks. The firm is getting away from their own principles. So the union in this case is saying, we're the ones who are holding management to their principles. It's not the management. So there's this interesting blurring of roles. And even when we go to the non-union plants, they're operating in a jurisdiction like Ontario, which has higher labor standards around controls on flexibility that their counterpart plants in the States do not. But what's interesting, on the one hand, it's seen as viewing, imposing these costs, yet managers said, actually, it's promoting us to be more innovative, to use labor in a more efficient way, a more innovative way. So, for example, having emergency lead days in Ontario, whereas other associates do not. But we have better quality. We have a more innovative workplace because we involve workers more. Okay. So, conclusions. Despite some trends towards automation and commodification, final assembly remains very labor intensive, and there are still these significant variations. Unions are a source of this variation, if not hybridization. It's hard for us to quantify what that really means, but it's there when we go to the plant level. But when we look at how this union role is portrayed in official policy about, say, for example, Industry 4.0, union role is seen as simply to hold down labor costs. There's no acknowledgement that unions actually could play another kind of role. And again, it's not having co-determination rights and other things. We've talked about what the pros and cons might be with that, but I think that they're not having any kind of legal input at that level really makes unions have a more difficult time in the sense of trying to represent their own workers' interests, not just simply the firm. So I will leave off there for now.
Excellent.